Okay, first up, we have Joshua talking about his experiences with UWS and OpenAPI.
Hello, everyone. There's a lot to get through, so I'll try and be quick. My name is Joshua Fraustro from MAST. And over the past 6 months or so, I've been looking at what it would take to implement the UWS pattern in an OpenAPI document. For those who don't know, I'm going to give a really quick summary, but an OpenAPI document is an industry standard way to describe a web service. You essentially write out in pretty both machine readable and human readable text what a web service's paths, operations, requests, and responses look like. So why did we pick UWS? Why did I pick UWS? It's, to be honest, a complex enough standard to be interesting, to prove this technology out. And it means we also don't have to deal with things like VO tables or data formats and responses. Everything is just protocol responses between a client and a service. So these are some of the objectives I had. This is pretty standard. It's essentially, can I describe this service with OpenAPI? I also wanted to solve some problems along the way. I won't touch on all of these. For folks who are in Sydney, I brought a couple of these up. This ended up being a little optimistic to get right out of the get-go. And I'll talk about why in a moment. So I presented a version of UWS in Sydney that had all of these fixes. And the reception was generally positive. We presented again in October to the apps members from the apps group. And like I said, the reception was generally good. They'd like to see this kind of documentation for UWS. But the concern was all of the little fixes I had added, that it was too much, too fast, there were breaking changes, and interoperability concerns with older clients. So I said, okay, how do I get from what I really want at the end with something that we can put in a standard today? So I, as an exercise, divided up my work into 3 sections. I want to prove that OpenAPI works as an iterative process, like all of our IVOA standards are. So I made 3 documents: as is, refinement, and what if. As is being a standard we could put in tomorrow, as closely as possible to the UWS standard, making changes that are otherwise impossible to avoid. Refinement, we're going to solve a few problems just to show that we can do it. And what if, solve all of the problems I pointed out before, and we'll get into some of this OpenAPI model stuff in a second. So the as-is version. UWS is already pretty straightforward to adapt to an OpenAPI description. It's already very RESTful. The paths, operations, there was no conflict with describing those. That was easy. Describing XML like the UWS schema is a little complex in OpenAPI, as are a lot of our XML schemas. So to address that, I said, okay, you know what? I'm not going to try and describe it here. I'm going to point it to the standards document we already have. There's no use changing that right now. We've got something there. This other little tiny one, the case-insensitive query parameters, that's a consequence of UWS operating under DAL in some circumstances. I had to make a choice there, and I'll show it to you in a moment. The read-octly linting, that's a linter I happened to install while working on these OpenAPI documents. And it noticed a status code problem that I'll also get to in just a moment. So here's an example of what an OpenAPI document for UWS might look like. We have our paths and operations on the left. That's pretty self-explanatory. You've got a job ID. Those are the operations you can do: post, get, delete. We've got an example of what query parameters and responses might look like here in the middle. And this is a schema definition for a job summary, one of the requests and responses, the payload that might come from one of these operations. This is what I ended up doing away with in this what can we do tomorrow version, pointing at an XSD schema. These are self-explanatory mostly. I've got a link there, so I'm not going to focus on these too much because I'd like to show you what the diffs and the iterative process looks like. So the refinement version, pick out a few small things I can fix and see what that looks like in a OpenAPI 1.2 version. So this query parameters may be uppercase or lowercase or any mix of them. It's a consequence of the DAL standard that says that should be the case. So just for this document, I said, okay, we're just going to make them lowercase. We'll deal with that. And this works fine under the context of TAP, which is underneath DAL. in a very like crazy niche scenario, this won't work, but otherwise it's pretty good. Almost all clients and services should deal with this perfectly fine. One of the other ones that I noticed that's very small, and so I thought it'd be a great change, is that requests to certain things in the UWS job document, like destruction and quote, are specified as having a 200 response code and an empty body. And that's not quite what HTTP would prefer. So I said, okay, in this version, we're going to set it to either 204, no content, and keep that empty response body, or you can set it to 200 and put a null in the response. I opted for the 204. And of course, these last two, they are breaking changes, but I mean, I think they'd be fairly simple to implement. That's why I picked them out. And another one that's not really HTTP, you know, we could debate about this one, but posting a job to create it to the job list results in a 303 redirect. Ideally, probably, if this is a REST kind of thing, it should be a 200 because we're returning the document. This is nitty gritty. Let me show you what it looks like. That's all you need. If you think about what it would require describing this change in the LaTeX document, and I'll get to that in a little bit, I can't imagine the lines of code change that would take. But here we've got just 3 changes. And I'll repeat this on a little bit later on, but these little diffs I'm showing are not about how easy or difficult it would be to implement. These are about showing how easy it is to document. So we get to the version I proposed in Sydney. I'm going to rope in all of the changes I just showed you and all the other little fixes I came up with. And most importantly, I'm going to describe the request and response job messages in the JSON schema format that OpenAPI works with. And that means natively, if we follow this, we get more varied encoding formats. We've heard 3 times already today that the transport protocols and the serialization methods that the IVOA currently uses are not compatible with some institutions. We would get that here. So we got a little RESTful thing. We're going to post the job document. Let's get rid of the form encoded key values. And of course, this is breaking, but it's worth giving a shot. So I started working on a prototype of this at MAST and developing a UWS base library that clients can use and services can use, because I think that might be one of the most valuable things we can provide to the community along with these documents. What does that look like? That's it. Describing the changes more or less looks like that. I had as an example here tap form encoded parameters one could send to a UWS service. You remove that and you just say you're going to send it an array of parameters. And lower on in that document, you've got a sort of a list of saying, okay, a parameter can be a string and it's got a value. Fairly straightforward. But this is all it takes to document this change. That would be a huge nightmare to document in the standard itself. And so I'm trying to demonstrate that we can both work iteratively in little steps, and it might give us some pretty good benefits when trying to work on these in the future. So like I said, the point here is not about how easy the changes are to implement, but how easy they are to document. We can take iterative steps. This version I just showed you, the as is one, it could be deployed tomorrow as long as we get some more eyes on it to review it, obviously. And we have a clear understanding of what might break at each iteration of this document. I'm going to skip past my conclusion here because I want to show you an example that I came up with just to make sure this wasn't some crazy fluke. I had ChatGPT, we all love it. All I asked was it to provide me an example of an API endpoint in the style of a pet store API as an example, in the style of an IVOA document. And it, for its credit, knows exactly what that looks like. This is what it spat out. I put it into LaTeX to format it nicely. But if you've read a web service in the IVOA, that's about what it looks like. And then I asked it to provide another one, but sneak in a breaking change. I presented this to some of my colleagues and asked them to time themselves. It took about 2 to 3 minutes for each person to find the breaking changes in these. One of my coworkers was quite smart and said, well, I'm just going to diff the LaTeX. If you've ever tried to diff the LaTeX between versions of IVOA documents, it looks a little bit like that. Especially if they've gone through rewrites from other authors. Anyone pick out the breaking changes? I got 15 seconds here, anyone? that's the breaking change. The parameters got renamed and 2 of the allowed values got changed. Just to flip between them, that versus this. Again, this is a breaking change. Clients and services might have to do quite a bit of work. Maybe they only have to do a little, but this is what I'm asking for. Easy to see documentation of those changes between versions. So sort of what's the idea here? What's my conclusion? Well, to mention it, and Pat's going to talk about it, TAP 1.2 will be implementing an OpenAPI spec, and that's going to need a UWS spec by itself as well. I encourage you all to take a look at the as-is version. If you pull up the slides, there's a GitHub link. They're not perfect. They're going to need more eyes, especially eyes that are smarter than mine. But I think it's ready to go. This is something we could integrate, a week from now, a month from now. We need to think about how we would implement these in our document publishing pipelines. That's, that's above my head. I'm sure there are a lot of people who come up with great ideas for that. I would like personally, even if we don't adopt that end version, I'm going to try to keep working on these JSON compatible versions, this implementation, this library, to understand what the future looks like. If we don't adopt mine or that end document, at least we've got some work going on that will help us understand what a JSON compatible UWS service might look like in the future. So thank you.
Thank you, Joshua.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any questions? Yeah, go back. Just a couple of questions. Save the rest for the discussion.
I ran a little long there, so go ahead.
Well, I think it's always good to have questions. I'm Dennis from IPAC. So I didn't catch exactly what did you mean by easy to shows how easy it's to document, not how to implement. What do you mean by implementation? I mean, it's OpenAPI spec. You just use generator, it generates few stubs for both server and client, or there is some other implementation was meant.
Yeah, that's absolutely a good point. We have had some success with using client and server generators because it's an OpenAPI document. Dave will talk a little bit about that. But for services that have hand-rolled their own, or clients that have their own code base, some of the things, getting rid of the form encoding and posting a document, that might require rework, right? But for at least anyone who is looking at that to implement those changes, what changed between them is pretty clear to see. That's one of my biggest gripes I have, is just making it clear what has changed in a really readable way. So.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you again.